The initial frost had yet to touch the distant corners of Carbon County, yet the chill was already descending from the mountain peaks. By the end of October, the aspens appeared pale and fragile, and the atmosphere carried that sharp stillness which caused dogs to whimper in their slumber and windmill blades to groan as if fading away. Jack Callan hardly paid attention to the cold any more. Not because he had become accustomed to it, but because it simply had no way to affect him now. At 44, he dwelled alone in a place that had previously served as a freight wagon, then transformed into a field infirmary during the war, later a border refuge for Cheyenne scouts, and at last his residence, if a man like him could still call such a thing home. The wagon leaned unevenly amid rusty farming tools and a partially fallen shed, encircled by barren earth, gentle hills, and crows soaring low in dark arcs across the sky resembling symbols from an ancient script. No one ventured so far north unless they were escaping from something or owed debts to someone more fearsome than death itself. Jack did not flee and held no obligations. He hunted silently through the valleys, exchanged pelts and dried meat with Linda, the Lakota widow residing on the eastern side of the pass, and mended the wire fences of the abandoned farms nearby whenever the wind tore them apart. He spoke only when necessary. He drank only if his hands trembled from the cold or haunting dreams. Although he kept a small handgun loaded and concealed beneath his cot, he had not drawn it in 5 years, not since the man wearing a crimson vest and a silver tooth had come chasing a bounty and left with a broken knee and a blood trail vanishing into the ravine. Residents of the nearby town called Hartley Ridge, which barely had 35 people when the skies were clear, nicknamed Jack a watchman. Not because he guarded anyone, but because he observed everything around him. Tales circulated about him. One claimed he once cut a man's throat with the shattered spur. Another said he used to speak Comanche perfectly until part of his tongue was sliced off, and some believed he slept with one eye open and the other hidden, inside a box under his floorboards. Jack ignored all of it. The more people dreaded him, the less they tried to pull him into their trivial conflicts. He had been involved once before. 6 years earlier, he had buried a woman on a sloping hill, her name eroded from the stone by poor carving and harsh weather. He had also lost a child, a tiny one that fit in the palm of his hand, wrapped in cloth and already cold. No grief remained in him now, only unending days, one after the other. That was the reason Jack came to town that October evening. Routine errands, tobacco, salt, flint, and axle grease. He always arrived close to closing, when the tavern was filled with noise and the general store stood nearly empty, when the preacher was too far gone in drink to acknowledge anyone and the blacksmith's dog had settled into the ashes. Jack moved through the town like a mist, seen but left alone. Yet, on this particular night, as he stepped across the square, something caused him to halt midway. There was no noise, no voice, just a break in the usual scene. A cage. Not a proper one, but an improvised jail made from an old pig pen frame and chicken wire, resting on a buckboard wagon with wheels sunk almost 6 inches into the dirt. Inside the cage, 2 figures appeared. A teenage girl, no older than 16, barefoot and expressionless, and a baby wrapped in a ragged petticoat, crying softly like a calf nearing the end of a long, dry spell. The woman, standing next to the wagon, had once possessed a beauty as sharp and unforgiving as a blade. Precise, perilous, designed to wound. Yet now her hair was slicked with grease, her lips stained with saliva, and her hands clutched a bottle of cheap bourbon as if it were her only salvation. She shouted at the crowd gathered around, mostly wanderers and farm workers seeking distraction. They both belong to me. I swear by the Lord who watches everything. I gave birth to her in the back of a hay cart and to him in a roadside ditch during a storm. My womb gave more than my heart ever could. Now they're no use to me. They eat, they cry, they stink. What I want is whiskey, not mouths to feed. Laughter erupted. Someone threw a coin. Another voice called out, "Will you take silver or bullets, Linda?" The infant's crying grew louder, not from fear, but from hunger. Slow, anguished wails that sent shivers down the spine. The girl remained silent. She sat motionless, one arm holding the child close, the other limply resting on her knee. Her gaze was not filled with desperation, nor was it dead. It was calculating, as if she had already figured every way this moment could collapse, patiently awaiting the final outcome. Jack did not move closer. Not yet. From across the square, he observed silently, his hand resting firmly on the bag of nails tucked inside his coat. He did not know the girl or the boy standing there, yet something stirred deep within his chest. Perhaps an old instinct or a scar that had never fully healed. Slowly, the crowd began to disperse. The woman raised her voice again, slurring her words. "I will take one jug, just one. I might even throw in the father's name if that makes it any better." No one answered her. The spectacle had ended. People had enjoyed their cruel entertainment and were already moving along. The girl, however, stayed still. Her eyes remained steady. She was not begging or trying to sway anyone. She simply held her ground. Then, when Jack started to turn away, she surprised him. She leaned forward, gently placed her lips on the baby's forehead, and then fixed her gaze directly on him. It was not a look of familiarity. It was as if she had chosen him. Amid all the torment she had endured, this was her final conscious gesture, to make someone truly see her and understand that she had not screamed, not pleaded, nor fallen to her knees. That gaze trailed Jack all the way back to his wagon. It followed him through the dim hours as the fire popped, and he wiped down the rifle he had not touched since 1982. It lingered when the crows avoided landing near his cabin the following dawn, and it stayed with him when he opened the door to find something beyond explanation. A baby's basket wrapped in a tobacco sack, resting on the frost-covered earth. Inside lay the infant, eyes wide open, breathing faintly, arms trembling. No letter, no trace of the girl, only a blood-stained handkerchief fastened to the basket's side. Beside it, on the ground, was his own knife, the one missing for months, clean, positioned, and somehow waiting. When Jack finally carried the baby indoors, the frost had started creeping up the windows like strange fingers from another realm. He bundled the child in a wool shirt and placed him near the stove, from which warmth seeped slowly through iron. Thin and fragile, with a red mark twisting like a question along his left cheek, the baby barely moved, his breath so faint Jack checked his pulse twice to confirm it was real. He had witnessed children pass away more quietly than rabbits, especially when they stopped expecting anyone to answer their cries. Jack had no milk, no comforting woman's touch, no cradle, no gentle words, only boiled water, softened jerky chewed as best he could, and silence. Yet the boy accepted it, swallowed what was offered, then fell asleep with a stillness reminding Jack of too many cold mornings across too many battlefields. The girl, however, had disappeared. For a moment, Jack thought she had abandoned the child, left the basket abruptly like an ordinary stone and vanished into the darkness, choosing hunger over the burden of an unfamiliar obligation. Yet then he spotted a thin line of blood on the porch railing, deliberate and precise, as if someone had wiped a sharp edge clean. He stepped outside. The chilly air stung his lungs sharply. The footprints were easy to trace. Not in snow so dry. They headed north toward the old ravine, a place where wolves had been seen just 2 nights before. He moved swiftly, driven not by fear, but determination. Still, he reached her first. She was crouched behind a fallen cedar tree, her hands stained with soil, eyes wide but calm. Nearby, face down and groaning, lay a man, one of the drifters from Hartley Ridge. His shoulder was split open, dark blood seeping into the ground. Jack did not ask any questions. The girl stayed silent. When she noticed him, she rose slowly, one hand still clutching a dull, corroded hatchet. Her dress was torn at the neckline. One corner of her lip was cut. She looked at him as if she was already halfway out of this world, as if she had not expected anyone to follow, find, or care about her. Jack remained silent. He moved past her and gently rolled the man onto his back. Recognition struck him hard. The man was Maynard, a notorious card cheat, occasional cattle thief, and the kind of scoundrel who always grinned too widely at girls who gave no smiles in return. Jack checked his pulse. Still alive. His gaze returned to the girl. She was trembling now, not from fear, but because her adrenaline was fading. Slowly, he reached out and took the hatchet from her hand. She released it without resistance. He did not ask if Maynard had tried to assault her. There was no need to. The answer was clear in her tense shoulders and clenched mouth. Jack dragged the man toward the edge of the ravine and left him there, half covered in snow and still breathing. Not out of kindness, but as a warning. Hartley Ridge would find him, and they would understand. Back by the wagon, the little boy remained fast asleep, his fingers curled into tiny fists. Jack placed a blanket over the girl and gestured toward the pot of stew. She did not eat immediately. Instead, she sat quietly, staring at the stove as if it were a sacred place, and she awaited permission to find comfort. After some time, she picked up a spoon and began to eat. Her bites were small and deliberate. When she finished, she rose without being asked, drew water from the barrel, and cleaned the bowl on her own. Then she returned to her seat and waited. Jack observed her closely, curious about who had taught her to behave that way, like a servant, invisible, useful, and silent. It was not submission, but a form of protection. She had learned to appear harmless because harmless girls were less likely to suffer punishment. He had witnessed this before. Later, as the wind roared against the wooden frame of the wagon and the fire faded into glowing red coals, she took out a small piece of cloth from her coat, a square cut from someone else's shirt, and unfolded it carefully. Inside, there were 2 items, a single hair ribbon and a silver button. She held them as if they were precious keepsakes. Jack did not ask any questions. He sat opposite her, quietly sharpening a blade. The silence between them was neither uneasy nor harsh. It simply existed. Finally, she spoke, not with a voice softened by fear, but with a steady tone, as if reciting words she'd repeated many times before. His name is Jamie. He is 8 months old. He doesn't sleep when it's noisy. He drinks goat's milk if it's warm enough, and if you hum, he calms down quicker. Jack stopped sharpening for a moment. She went on. He isn't sick, but he doesn't cry loudly, just quietly, like he's scared to make a sound. Her voice trembled briefly, but she kept going. She used to shake him when he cried. One time she left him outside overnight. Said if he wanted to be born, he had to prove it. Jack exhaled deeply through his nose. Words would not make a difference in this moment. Instead, he gave a single nod, put down the blade, and rose to his feet. Reaching into the chest, he pulled out a saddle blanket and handed it to her. As she settled down, draping it around her shoulders, he spoke softly. "Do you have a name?" She fixed her gaze on him for a long time, the kind of gaze that makes most people look away. Finally, she murmured, "Sarah." Just that, no surname, no further details. Jack did not press for more. He merely nodded and repeated, "Sarah." It felt like laying the first brick in a foundation that neither of them intended to build. The following morning, news traveled through the town that Maynard had been discovered alive, though half frozen and delirious. He recounted a strange tale about a girl, a child, and a scarred man with a crow perched on his shoulder who never blinked. Many townsfolk dismissed the story with a roll of their eyes, while others cast suspicious looks. The sheriff inquired quietly, avoiding drawing attention. No one wanted to provoke the man in the wagon, especially when danger seemed so real. Yet, danger arrived all the same. 3 evenings later, Jack returned from the ridge carrying rabbit meat and noticed the wagon door left open, the fire barely burning. Inside, Linda stood clutching a shotgun pointed at the ground, her hands trembling. Before her, a man sat tied to the table leg with rope taken from Jack's tack. His face was swollen and bruised. A knife rested on the floor beside him. "He came looking," she explained. "Said I owed him. Said Jamie isn't mine. Said I was just the one who survived." Her voice did not rise. It fell quietly, like ice melting away in early spring. Jack did not question if her words were true. It was irrelevant. What mattered was that she had not fled or screamed. She had protected a child using nothing but rope, steel, and her own bare hands. Jack untied the man, dragged him outside, leaving him in the dirt with a broken nose and a clear message. Never come north again. That was the final attempt anyone made to take Jamie. Yet, it was not the last time someone tried to steal the truth. Later, as the boy slept and Linda was braiding a strip of cloth into a cord, Jack asked a question he had not intended to voice. "Why him?" She looked up, puzzled. "Jamie. Why keep him? You could have left him." Her hands stopped moving. She remained silent for a moment. Then, softly, "Because he doesn't know how to leave me. And that means I don't get to leave him." And Jack, who had once buried a daughter he never got to hold, felt a deeper understanding in that instant than words could express. That evening marked the moment he started crafting the crib. Not from ordinary pine, not from lumber bought at the store. Instead, from cedar boards he had kept from the home that was lost to fire many years before, the one he never mentioned. Each nail hammered into that crib carried the weight of a promise. Every groove carved symbolized a solemn pledge. Once finished, he gently placed Jamie inside and watched as the boy's small hands gripped the edge as if they were roots searching for earth. Linda smiled, for the very first time, not wide or radiant, but genuine. And from that moment on, they were no longer strangers accidentally bound together. They had become something different. Not quite a family, but close enough to cause pain if torn apart. Winter had not yet fully gripped the earth, but its touch was already laid bare upon the land's bare bones. Days grew shorter, edged sharply with winds carrying the scents of stone and ancient ash, while nights slipped in early, like a thief returning to a familiar scene. Inside the wagon, the air had thickened with the smell of coal smoke and the warmth shared by two bodies, uncertain of what it truly meant to occupy the same space. Jack moved exactly as he always had, measured, quiet, with the stance of a man convinced that walls should remain silent and visitors should not overstay. But something had changed in the way he opened the door more slowly these days, as if listening. Carefully first, or how he consistently kept the fire burning high before stepping out to gather water from the semi-frozen creek. Linda, meanwhile, kept her distance. Yet the silence between them took on a texture that was no longer empty. It gained weight and form, even a kind of rhythm, like wind sweeping over canvas that had finally been stretched tight after hanging loose for far too long. She started to talk more often. Not frequently or at length, but when she did, her speech was filled with the assuredness of someone who had been compelled to learn the art of surviving. She understood how to skin a rabbit, prepare healing poultices from moss growing beneath birch trees, and weave cords tough enough to restrain an adult man's wrist. Jack observed the way she carried herself, not like a young woman trained for chores around the house, but like someone brought up among tools, flames, and hardship. She had the skill to vanish into a room, yet remain aware of every subtle movement inside. She kept the child very close, always secured to her body, or cradled in a sling she made from an old saddle blanket. But sometimes she would place him in the crib Jack built and gaze at him for long moments, as if imprinting his image into her memory, in case she had to part from him once more. Then the snow arrived. Not the gentle kind that softly promises warmth, but the heavy, relentless type that swallowed fences whole and transformed roads into treacherous white ribbons. Jack had left early to check the traps and stayed out longer than usual. When he finally came back, soaked to his waist and limping slightly from slipping on a hidden rock, he discovered Linda perched on the roof of the wagon, a hammer in her hand, sealing a leak with tar and strips of hide. The baby slept inside, safe by the fire. She was there alone, her hair clinging to her forehead, her face pale from the cold, but her jaw firm and unyielding. He didn't ask how she had managed to climb up. He didn't question how she located the leak. Without a word, he handed her another nail and steadied the ladder as she continued to work. Later that night, the silence fractured. Linda stood near the stove, carefully unwrapping dried meat, her hands trembling from the chill when she said, "I once broke a man's leg. Not Maynard, someone else. He tried to claim me, thinking that if he paid enough, I wouldn't resist. But I did." Jack remained quiet, pouring hot water into 2 tin mugs. She avoided his gaze and kept speaking, her voice rough and worn like stones grinding wood. "They believe that if you're small, you'll stay small. But even rabbits bite when their home is threatened." Jack passed her a mug. Their fingers touched briefly. Neither pulled away nor flinched. Then came the night that almost shattered everything they had built. Jamie began coughing, a harsh, moist rattle that shook his small ribs and turned his sleep into soft whimpers. Linda barely rested. She remained seated by the crib, giving him tiny spoonfuls of water boiled with pine bark and salt. Jack brought her herbs from the ridge, those he remembered Linda using long ago before her lungs failed. Linda never questioned, only ground the herbs into poultices, massaged them onto the child's chest, and sang to him in a voice so low it was barely a whisper. One night, as snow piled heavily against the door like a silent judgment, Linda reached out and touched Jack's sleeve while he handed her the kettle. It was not a grasp, but just a gentle touch of her fingertips on his forearm, like a quiet echo of unspoken thoughts. Jack looked down at her, and for the first time, she held his gaze. Her eyes, red and tired, carried something profound and unusual. Thankfulness mixed with caution, sorrow wrapped in stubborn hope. She said plainly, "He's getting better. You've given me time." Jack said nothing. He simply set the kettle down, sat beside her on the floor, and together they listened quietly to the baby's breaths, as if that sound was something precious to protect. The following morning, the wind had settled, and the snow had hardened into firm, crusty sheets. Jack stepped outside to clear the pathway and inspect the shed. When he came back, he noticed Linda was not inside the wagon, but crouched in the snow behind it, a rifle resting across her lap. As he drew closer, she gestured toward the trees. "Riders," she whispered. There were two, perhaps three individuals, too distant to make out clearly, yet close enough to demand attention. Jack remained calm. He took the rifle from her, examined the chamber, and placed it aside. "Inside," he instructed. "You and the boy." She paused momentarily. "I can shoot." "I understand," he responded. "But if anything goes wrong, you won't be the one they remember." The riders did not advance. They hovered at the forest's edge for nearly 30 minutes, then disappeared the way they had come. Jack observed them until they were completely out of sight, spending the rest of the day checking traps while keeping one hand near his revolver. That evening, as Linda mended a tear in Jamie's swaddle, she remarked, "They were not just watching. They were assessing, deciding if we are worth the effort." Jack simply nodded. Let them keep wondering. It had become obvious that they were not as concealed as they had wished. This realization meant difficult decisions were inevitable. The wagon was too small and delicate to withstand any long-term attack. The cabin where Jack had once lived had burned down, but its stone base remained firmly in the valley. Jack suggested they rebuild it, not as a permanent dwelling, but for shelter and protection. Linda agreed, and over the following days they carried stones and timber through the snow, shaping a refuge from the wilderness that, if fortune smiled upon them, could become their sanctuary. The labor was exhausting, harsh, unyielding, and raw, but Linda never voiced complaints. She lifted more than double her weight in stones, chopped wood until her palms were covered in blisters, and each night placed Jamie to sleep on a folded blanket near the incomplete fireplace. One evening, brushing snow off her jacket as she settled by the fire, she said, "I used to believe surviving meant staying quiet, blending in, making yourself invisible. Now, I think surviving means constructing something they cannot steal from you." Jack looked at her then with an expression not of a protector or a man seeking forgiveness, but of someone who sees a storm approaching and chooses to face it regardless. That night, after the baby had fallen asleep and the flames dwindled to glowing embers, Jack took a piece of chalk and drew a line across the wooden beam above the door. When Linda asked what it meant, he answered, "This marks day one, the start of something that belongs to us, not just a relic left behind." In that instant, she rose and did something neither of them had anticipated. She reached up and drew a second line next to his. "Then we count together," she declared. It was not a sign of trust. It was not an expression of love. Still, it was the first gesture they performed that did not involve fleeing. For people like them, that carried more meaning than either was willing to voice aloud. The winter grew deeper, filled with a silence that felt more like reproach than calm, pressing heavily over the land until even the wind seemed to pause between gusts. The cabin, only half finished, was a dark blemish upon the snowbanks, its stone walls just reaching waist level, its roof merely a skeleton of pine logs and frozen determination. Nevertheless, every day Jack and Sarah returned, carrying what they could manage, braving cold that seeped through their boots and chilled them to the bone. Jamie had stopped coughing mostly. His rest was restless still, yet he nourished better, his cheeks now tinged with faint hues of life. He had begun reaching out, tiny hands closing with intention toward the fire's glow, the folds of Sarah's coat, the edge of Jack's sleeve. Silent in his efforts, no coo or cry escaped him, only breath and movement, like a spirit feeling its connection to a mortal frame. Jack observed him more frequently these days, less out of worry and more with a strange reluctant tenderness that he concealed behind roughened hands and low murmurs. The boy was not his own, bore no part of his lineage or inheritance, yet occasionally when Jamie pressed his cheek against Jack's chest, the man remained still a moment longer, as if fearful to move lest the child disappear like smoke. One evening, the sky shifted in that peculiar manner it did only before the fiercest storms, turning a shade too dull, the air too motionless, and the quiet so absolute it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. Jack was the first to notice. He halted mid-chop, axe raised above a block of frozen wood, and narrowed his eyes toward the horizon. No movement, no birdsong, no breeze. Only a pressure building in his ears, like a heavy weight descending. He let the axe fall without completing the stroke. Inside the wagon, Linda was boiling cloth and slicing dried roots into thin strips for tea. Jack stepped inside, said nothing, and started fastening shutters, stuffing worn rags into the door frame. Linda did not question him. She simply lowered the heat under the stove, wrapped Jamie more securely in his sling, and pulled on her boots. That was what had changed between them. They no longer needed spoken warnings. They just understood. But neither of them expected it to arrive so quickly. Within 60 minutes, snow began to fall. Not gentle flakes, but sharp, biting grains that stung upon touch and hissed as they landed. The temperature plunged rapidly. The trees started to creak beneath ice they had not supported for many decades. Then, just as night consumed the ridges, a wind arrived. Not a soft howl, but a piercing scream, sudden and forceful, tearing across the landscape as if dragging something heavy behind it. The fire inside the stove flickered weakly. The wagon groaned beneath the strain. Jamie whimpered softly, clutching tightly to Sarah's chest. Jack cursed quietly to himself, slipped on his coat and stepped outside with the lantern swinging at his side. The roof of the shed rattled violently. He reached halfway before the strong gusts snatched the lantern and smashed it against the frozen wall. In the darkness, he finally arrived at the shed and began securing whatever he could: ropes, pelts, the drying rack. Suddenly, a deep crack sounded. Not lightning, not a falling branch, but something more profound. The ground itself trembled. Jack turned and saw it. The stovepipe, torn loose by the wind, had crashed backwards into the wagon, casting sparks everywhere. Flames rose immediately, fed by the dry wood and pitch-catching fire within moments. He ran without hesitation. Sarah was already outside. Jamie held firmly in her arms, her hair wild and framing her face, eyes shining with reflected flames. Jack grabbed her elbow, pulling her back as the heat spread fiercely. The wagon moaned and then collapsed. It did not explode, but simply crumpled, like a fading memory overwhelmed by its own weight. Everything inside, bedding, food supplies, tools, even the crib, was lost. They remained silent. There was nothing left to say. In the blazing light, with the snow turning into a fierce storm and the wind howling like a curse, Jack pointed toward the cabin. It had no roof, only stone walls, enough to block the wind, though not the cold. They hurried, Jamie cradled between them, his small body silent but warm. They arrived just as the wind tore the last board from the wagon's frame and sent it crashing down. Inside the cabin shell, Jack sparked a small flame using dry kindling he had hidden beneath the floor stones. The smoke hung low, but the fire burned steadily. Linda crouched in the corner. Jamie pressed close to her chest, and for the first time since the night they met, she appeared frightened. Not angry or defensive, simply vulnerable. Jack sat beside her, took off his coat, and covered them both. For a while, they were silent as the wind tried to sneak through the stone walls, and the snow hissed against what remained of the frame above. Then she whispered, "I always thought, when it burned, I would feel free." He turned to look at her. "The wagon?" She shook her head. "The past." Jack closed his eyes. His hands still carried the scent of smoke. His bones ached in that familiar way they had since the war, a reminder that he had survived but left parts of himself buried in the snow. He reached out with hesitation and laid his hand gently on Jamie's back. The boy shifted. Linda did not pull away. She said softly, "I named him after a ghost." Jack did not ask which ghost. She did not explain. Outside, the wind ceased just before dawn. Inside, the fire continued to flicker, barely holding on. In the space between ruin and dawn, something changed once more. It was not loud. It did not announce itself. Instead, it moved softly, like roots shifting beneath frozen earth, calm, persistent, and unavoidable. They had lost all their possessions, yet they remained together. Not quite yet. The days after the fire blended into a routine that seemed less about recovery and more about adapting to a harsh new reality. The half-finished cabin served as their sole refuge, open to the sky but shielded from the wind. Furs hung from the rafters and tarps stretched over the beams kept the snow at bay. Jack strengthened the walls, hammering nails into icy wood with fingers numb from cold, while Sarah melted snow to gather water and showed Jamie how to sip from a tin cup she had fashioned a handle for. Their provisions were gone. No flour, no salt, only what Jack could catch and what Sarah could prepare from bark and roots. Hunger was familiar to them both, but now it felt crueler, less forgiving. This was the kind of hunger that made sleep fragile and patience thin. Yet there were moments filled with quiet tenderness. Jack's baby began to crawl, slowly and awkwardly across the furs, his tiny hands reaching for the comfort and warmth of the fire or the edge of Jack's heavy boot. On one occasion, Jack found him chewing on an empty bullet casing but did not yell. Instead, he swapped it for a strip of jerky and mumbled, "It is best to learn early what danger truly tastes like." Linda chuckled at that, a sound low and unexpected, rough from disuse. In that instant, Jack realized he had not heard genuine laughter in more than a year. Not since the night the river froze completely and swallowed the last of his mules beneath the ice. Outside their delicate refuge, the world had not forgotten them. It had grown uneasy and restless. Rumors first stirred in Hartley Ridge, quiet at the start, barely more than whispers that lingered in tavern corners and traveled on the backs of supply wagons. Maynard, only half recovered but burning with anger, had been spreading tales again. tales about the woman with the blade and the infant she claimed was not hers, about the man with lifeless eyes and shadowed silence who had left Maynard to bleed out on the snowy ground. At first, people listened and dismissed the stories. Then they listened once more, for when stories are repeated, they breed doubt, and doubt always seeks someone to blame. By the moment spring's initial thaw transformed the paths into streams of mud, the whispers carried weight. A preacher's spouse insisted she had spotted Sarah in town years earlier, already with child. Although no man had ever stepped forward, the general store attendant murmured he once saw Jack hold a baby, as if it were a heavy stone. Not how a man should cradle a child. Elderly women near the boarding house remembered how Sarah had been cast out from her mother's residence. Her name erased from the family Bible. Nobody questioned why. Nobody considered what it cost a girl to vanish in such a way. They only recalled the voids and filled them with dread. Then the preacher himself arrived, one-eyed, white-bearded, with a voice filled with scripture and sharpness. He came up the mountain path riding a borrowed mule, a Bible in one hand and a petition in the other. He spotted Jack chopping wood and skipped the formalities. "You have taken in a prostitute and a bastard, Mr. Callan," he stated plainly, "and it stains this county more than it can bear." Jack kept chopping, not even glancing up. The preacher continued. "People are uneasy. They say the boy is cursed, that he never cries, that she never rests, that wolves gather outside your cabin at twilight." He paused, steadying the reins. "They want them gone. Sent to the mission, perhaps, or returned to where she came from. You may stay, naturally. No one seeks conflict, only calm." Jack swung the axe and cleaved a log cleanly in two, then asked, "Have you ever read the part where Christ said, 'Let the little children come to me'?" The preacher sneered and replied, "Not when they enter this world tainted by sin." Jack lifted his gaze slowly and sharply. "Then you better read it again. The entire passage. Not just the sections that justify your own cowardice." The preacher walked away, but not without making a scene. By the end of the week, a small group arrived, 3 men and 2 women, all dressed in their Sunday best with stern faces that barely concealed their self-righteous fear. Linda noticed them first. She was washing Jamie in a wooden basin outside, softly humming to herself, when she glimpsed movement beyond the tree line. She did not scream or run. She simply wrapped the baby, handed him to Jack, and grabbed the rifle resting against a tree stump. They did not pull out weapons immediately. At the start, they tried politeness. They talked about the welfare of the community, unease among the respectable families, and concerns regarding unnatural conduct. As a favor, they politely asked if Linda would consider leaving. They claimed she frightened the livestock and that dogs would not stop barking when she passed by. They said the air around her felt strange. Linda remained silent, standing quietly with the rifle aimed at the ground. Jack waited until they finished speaking, then posed a single question. "Which one of you intends to take the child from her arms?" No one spoke. He moved forward, carrying Jamie in one arm while his other hand stayed on the knife attached to his belt. She kept him alive through the harsh winter, nourished him when her own body was empty, watched over him when the fire destroyed everything. Do you really believe some godless decree gives you the right to take that away from her? His voice was quiet, yet thunderous in impact. If you want him, come and take him. But I assure you, mercy will not be found. Only graves await. they departed, not all of them by choice. For a while, the mountain returned to silence. Yet silence is never true peace. It is merely the calm before the scream. One evening, as distant thunder rumbled and the wind carried the sharp scent of damp ash, Jamie began to cry. A raw, uncontrollable scream that shook his small frame and reddened his face. He did not cease. Linda rocked him gently, sang softly, offered warm milk and cool cloths, murmured prayers she had not uttered since childhood. Nothing eased his distress. Jack stoked the fire higher, searched for fever, injuries, or broken bones. Jamie's cries continued relentlessly until suddenly he stopped, too abruptly. His body became limp, not lifeless but detached, as though something inside him had turned off. Jack held him, heart racing, uncertain of what he was witnessing. Linda took him back, laid him down carefully, pressed her ear to his chest, then whispered, "He's in shock." Then, as if moved by an unseen force, she stood up, walked to the rear of the cabin, and began removing stones from the floor. Jack did not realize the truth until Linda revealed the bundle. Old fabric, wrapped carefully in wax paper and tied with string. Inside was a photograph. A man appeared with a strong jawline, dressed in uniform, his eyes strikingly similar to Jamie's. Along with the image was a name, written in the shaky handwriting on the back. Ben Tillman, July 5th, 1885. Linda handed the photo to Jack and explained. That was his father. He died during a mine collapse in Missouri. They erased his memory, claimed he was unworthy. My family insisted I was inventing stories. They said I was chasing a ghost. She then knelt next to Jamie and added, "He is not cursed. He is mourning someone he never had the chance to know, like me." Jack did not respond. He simply sat down beside her and silently placed his hand on Jamie's chest, and he waited. That evening, the boy moved slightly. His small hand closed gently around Jack's thumb. Linda, her eyes dry yet red with emotion, whispered, "You cannot repair what people fear, but you can survive beyond it." For once, Jack found himself believing she was right. Spring arrived with its usual fury, flooding riverbeds, cracking rocks as the thaw released its grip, and breaking branches as if they were delicate bones. The valley stirred with the signs of new life, yet the hills remained stubbornly frozen, the ground still firm and the frost lingering like a haunting memory. Jack had finally constructed a proper roof over the cabin, sloped and tarred using beams rescued from the old mill. Meanwhile, Linda had planted a row of early potatoes in a trench behind the barn. Jamie, now taking unsteady steps like a young foal, wandered in circles near the fire pit, sometimes dragging a stick, sometimes clutching a tin cup as if it were a precious gem. They were piecing together what looked like life, though the air still carried the faint smell of smoke. However, they were both aware that this calm was temporary and fragile. One morning, the quiet was broken by hooves striking wet stones. A sharp, steady sound too purposeful for mere travelers and too many to be ordinary merchants. Jack stood on the porch, his rifle already slung across his chest, while Linda silently moved Jamie indoors. 4 men entered the clearing, all clad in tan coats, their spurs jingling, guns loosely hanging at their sides. They bore no official badges, yet carried the unmistakable air of authority. Perhaps self-appointed, but heavy and undeniable nonetheless. The leader, a broad man with a scar crossing his temple and a star pinned to his vest, dismounted slowly and approached. "Are you Jack Callan?" the man asked, his voice rough like gravel soaked in whiskey. Jack gave a single nod. The man motioned behind him. "These men have arrived under the authority of territorial law. That girl in your cabin, she's charged with theft, sedition, desertion, and helping fugitives. There's even whispers of witchcraft." He grinned without warmth. "Quite a dossier for such a small thing." Jack remained silent. The man cocked his head. "We're taking her. You can make this simple, or you can make it educational." Sarah then stepped forward, carrying Jamie on her hip. Her gaze was steady. She did not beg or plead. She walked up beside Jack and said simply, "No." Nothing more. No screams, no tears. Just a firm declaration. The stillness held. Suddenly, the man advanced, but Jack was quicker. The butt of his rifle hit the man's jaw with a sound like a breaking branch, and all hell broke loose. The other men drew their guns. Jack fired once, hitting one in the leg, then dove behind a stack of barrels. Sarah placed Jamie gently on the ground, pushed him behind the well, and grabbed the rifle hidden beneath the porch. The air filled with smoke and shouts. Jamie cried out, his small voice piercing like a flare. One man tried to circle the cabin. Sarah hit him in the shoulder, knocking him down. Another bullet grazed Jack's side. He stumbled but kept shooting. Then the fire erupted. A lantern, knocked over during the chaos, caught onto the side of the barn. Flames leapt up as if they had been waiting for this moment. The horses shrieked in panic, and thick smoke quickly filled the clearing. Sarah sprinted toward the well, grabbed Jamie, then spun around and saw Jack kneeling, blood streaming from his thigh, while the lead rider stood above him with a revolver aimed directly at his forehead. She didn't hesitate. She didn't take careful aim. She only screamed and pulled the trigger. The bullet struck the man in the neck, and he fell silently, blood splattering the stone beneath him. Jack collapsed backwards, his breathing harsh and uneven. The other riders scattered, dragging the injured and fleeing from the fire and fallen bodies. Sarah dropped the gun and rushed to Jack's side. He was barely conscious, jaw clenched tight, one hand pressed firmly against the wound where blood flowed rapidly and hot. She tore off his belt, tied it above the injury, and pressed a cloth into the open wound. He said nothing, only looked at her with the calm resolve he had always shown when teaching her how to read the wind. She whispered, "Stay with me." He blinked once in response. She repeated, "Do not leave." Jamie then crawled onto his lap, wrapping small arms clumsily around Jack's ribs. He made a sound, somewhere between a groan and a laugh. Sarah glanced at them both and realized that no one else was coming. No doctor, no lawman, no savior, only them. So she dragged Jack inside, lit a fire, boiled water, and did whatever was necessary to save him. She carefully stitched the injury, using strands of her own hair pulled from a comb, and held Jack's hand whenever his trembling became too intense. Jack remained silent. He did not scream. Yet once, as his temperature soared, he murmured a single word. "Stay." She complied. For 3 full days she did not close her eyes. With one hand she fed Jamie, while with the other she kept Jack's head cool. On the 4th day, the fever finally subsided. When Jack's eyes opened and he noticed her curled up beside him, gripping Jamie protectively as if he were a shield, he reached out, weak and shaking, and placed his hand gently on the boy's back. There were no promises made, no declarations spoken, only the touch, simply being there. And for them, that was everything. By the time the snow arrived again, Gentler this season and without fury, the cabin remained intact. The barn had vanished, its blackened frame buried beneath fresh ashes, but the house stood firm. Walls mended, roof covered with rough-hewn wooden shingles, windows fitted with glass panes salvaged from a closed church Linda had once helped restore. Long ago, when she still thought that hard work could make amends. Now it represented something different altogether. It was not a stronghold nor a sanctuary, simply a shelter that offered warmth throughout the night and a silence that did not judge. Jack walked more slowly these days, his injured leg always reminding him, growing stiffer whenever the cold wind blew, but he kept moving. He cared for the fire with a tenderness he had previously reserved only for arms. He whittled a new cradle from pine he had dried himself, smoother than the previous one, shaped with calm rather than haste. Jamie had started speaking in fragments, odd blends of sounds and meanings, some taken from Sarah's gentle tone, others clipped like the way Jack commanded a stove or a mule. The boy ran in uneven circles, fell frequently, but he always laughed as he rose, his spirit a kind of rebellion in itself. Sarah had transformed as well. She no longer glanced nervously behind her while chopping wood. Once a month, she strode into town with her head held high, her jaw firm, and Jamie cradled on her hip, daring anyone to say a word against her. They did not any more. The preacher had disappeared. Some claimed he had fled the entire county. The others had fallen silent. There were no arrests and no court cases. The mountain had absorbed too much blood for any law to take hold. Instead, murmurs faded away. Fear shifted to other targets. What remained, like lingering smoke after a wildfire, was a peculiar kind of respect. Not warmth or trust, but something heavier. The kind of gravity a community attaches to things it cannot fully grasp yet refuses to confront. That winter, Jack began teaching Sarah to read properly. Not merely names or signs, but complete sentences, dense paragraphs, old ledger books, and worn storybooks that had somehow survived harsh weather and the ravages of war. At first, she read cautiously, lips barely moving, her finger following each word as if navigating unknown terrain. But her progress was swift. Before long, she stopped asking for assistance. Instead, she read aloud to Jamie in the evenings, her voice calm and steady, unfolding stories from pages written for lives far different from their own, and yet somehow deeply familiar. One evening, as snow quietly settled against the windows and the fire flickered softly in the fireplace, Sarah was reading from a children's primer about a boat crossing a river and a man who gave his coat to a child. When she finished, she glanced over and saw Jack asleep, not slumped or collapsed, but resting with his arms folded and one boot still half-laced, as though he intended to get up soon but forgot. Jamie was curled up at his feet. She did not wake either of them. Instead, she gently put the book aside and simply watched their steady breathing. Their lives were not filled with happiness, yet they were lives made by choice, and for them, that was everything. In the early days of spring, Jack placed a stone at the field's boundary. There was no name inscribed, no dates recorded, only a carving stood out, a crow soaring with wings wide open, etched deeply into the granite. When Sarah asked about it, he replied, "Not everything needs to be voiced to be remembered." She understood perfectly. Years went by, but the mountain never ceased to remember them. Travelers spoke of a man with a limp, and a girl who could shoot more accurately than many men, and a boy who once never cried but now sang to the goats and named the wind. Some claimed the cabin had been a fortress, Others insisted it was a prison. Yet those who stayed long enough, who saw the garden Sarah tended and the porch Jack restored every spring, shared a different tale. They said it was a new beginning, and for them that was enough.